Thanks so much for having me, and thank you all for being here today. So as I put into the chat, the presentation slides are available to download if anyone would like them, and I put the link in there one more time. So that's the slides I'll be using today. So this talk is about teacher agency. I'll be unpacking a bit of what that is, and in particular looking at it through the lens of our relationships to fellow librarians. And yeah, it's based on an online survey that I did a few years ago that kind of ended up having multiple dimensions to it. So it was kind of a long-term project a few years ago. I actually presented LIT on a different dimension of this project when it was in the beginning stages. Okay, so I am going to share my screen. All right, so this is Teaching Librarians Experiences of Individual and Shared Agency, the Lens of Librarian Relationships and Workplace Culture. So thinking about this conference theme, it's called Bridging the Gaps. And when we think about bridging gaps in our instructional work, we might first think of students or of faculty who we work with a lot. We might not think as immediately of our librarian colleagues because we're kind of looking outward oftentimes. But while we might be working with students just during one session or might be seeing faculty once or twice a year, we see each other every day. So I'm gonna explore this idea of teacher agency from what is sometimes called an ecological perspective, where we take into account the environments that we are working in and interacting in, and thinking about how those influence how we teach and what choices we experience having in our teaching context. So this presentation is going to focus specifically on librarians' workplace relationships and environments in their experiences of teacher agency, which is essentially the ability to enact power and choice in teaching. So as an opening reflection, I'm going to invite you all to consider these two questions. What do you think of when you hear the phrase teacher agency? And what role do your professional relationships and interactions play in your experiences of teacher agency? So I'll stop sharing my screen for just a moment and give people a chance to put into the chat any immediate thoughts you have. So again, those questions are, what do you think of when you hear the phrase teacher agency, and what role do your professional relationships and interactions play in your experiences of teacher agency? You can actually put those two questions into the chat as well. Okay, one person saying freedom as a teacher. Applying your own teaching philosophy. Freedom on how you teach the topics, the freedom to teach and assign what you want, and kind of connects with intellectual freedom to some extent. Okay, we can continue thinking about this question, and we can return to it later as well. We'll have time for discussion. So I'm going to share my slides again. So there's research that shows that experiencing a sense of agency, a sense that you can have power in your environment and can act on that environment, is vital to overall workplace well-being. And our workplace environments and relationships are highly influential in our experiences of enacting agency or feeling unable to do so. In supportive environments, we're better able to trust our own expertise and to experience a sense of meaning and purpose in what we do. And these are really key parts of experiencing a sense of agency. Now, exploring our experiences relating to and interacting with colleagues in the context of teaching can be a way to appreciate how we and our colleagues support one another in our pedagogical practices, and also to recognize challenges we experience in those interactions, because I think we're all familiar with some unique challenges that librarians sometimes have, and the degree to which we feel we have choice and agency when we are teaching. So that knowledge that we gain of our interactions with colleagues, how we experience a sense of agency, whether individually or collectively, in those environments, can inform our pedagogical practices. It can help us identify the kinds of conditions and experiences that support us as teachers. And it can help us work individually and collectively to foster and sustain those conditions and experiences. So in this presentation, I'll be sharing findings from a study I did, an online survey of academic librarians about their conceptions and experiences of teacher agency. And that study ended up unfolding a lot of different layers. And so the layer that I'm going to really focus on today is librarian relationships. So first, I'm going to introduce the concept of an ecological model of teacher agency, which draws from different fields like sociology and thinks about environments and relationships and interactions. And then I'll discuss the study focus and key findings related to librarian relationships. I will then actually zoom out and look at some related literature, things that connect with teacher agency and librarianship. I know normally you do a literature review first, but in this case, it seemed to me to make more sense to kind of focus on the study first and then to connect it with other conversations in the profession. And then we'll have some time for discussion. So an ecological model of teacher agency, this is not my unique phrase. First of all, what is agency? We might think of agency as the capacity to act and have an effect on one's environment. And often in more individualistic cultures, like in the US, there is a focus on agency as something that an individual either possesses or lacks, and that this person can either work as an independent agent or not. But there have been debates in sociology and related fields about, to what extent people have autonomous, independent agency, and looking at the social systems, the social structures, the environments, the relationships that influence how we experience having choice, and not necessarily just having choice as individuals, but also sometimes having choice as groups. So that agency can be individual or it can be shared. And as I suggested a moment ago, psychological research on agency shows that it's important for well-being, and it's also important in the workplace. An ecological model of teacher agency draws from fields like sociology, and it considers agency as experienced and enacted by interconnected individuals and groups, rather than being something that autonomous individuals either possess or lack. And that view of agency also considers agency as continually in flux and embedded within a social context in a moment in space and time. So, my experience of agency at this particular moment might look very different, in a different setting or at a different time in my life. This study was looking at teacher agency, which was defined as the capacity or enacting of agency that teaching professionals experience in their teaching roles. So before people completed the survey, I presented them with that definition. Concepts of teacher agency have been evolving over time with growing attention to social environment and relationships. So what's again been called an ecological model of teacher agency. So previously, a lot of the discussions about teacher agency really focused more on kind of individual teachers by themselves in the classroom. Do they, have a sense of agency or not? It was a little bit, I think, a little bit more of a simplistic view than what has developed in recent decades. So this study I did got broken into 3 different parts, and I have 3 separate publications, one of them already out, and then a couple that will be coming out. So the first article talked about conceptions and affective orientations towards teacher agency. So for example, when people hear the concept teacher agency, what are some of the feelings and emotions that are evoked for them? And sometimes those are positive, sometimes they are, ambivalent, uncertainty, or mixed feelings, and on rare occasion, they might even be negative. Then I looked at the role of librarian-faculty relations and experiences of teacher agency, and then what I'll focus on today is the role of librarian relationships. So the survey questions, I'm going to present those on 2 slides. In what ways do you experience agency in your library instruction work? What factors or conditions contribute to your sense of agency? And then in what ways do you experience lacking agency in your instruction work? What factors or conditions contribute to this? Do certain strategies, approaches, or ideas help you experience a greater sense of agency? Do certain strategies, approaches, or ideas help you manage experiences of lacking agency? Does the concept of teacher agency evoke for you certain thoughts, ideas, or feelings? So, people are inevitably going to have different understandings of what teacher agency is. And part of the purpose of this study was to try to kind of unpack what some of those different understandings are. So the study findings, focusing here mainly on intersections between teacher agency and librarian relationships. Affective orientations, most people felt positively overall about the concept of agency. Just one person actually expressed negative feelings about agency, thinking of it as kind of a responsibility and a burden that they alone shouldered, that no one else was there to help them with teaching. And so having that agency, in their mind, a responsibility, was actually perceived as a not enjoyable thing. Almost all participants identified challenges with enacting teacher agency, and many expressed ambivalence about the degree to which teacher agency is possible for instruction librarians. And often those challenges were related to things like, often teaching one-shots where, you're working with a faculty member and looking to prioritize their needs and sometimes the approaches that they prefer to take. Participants frequently referenced their interactions with others when they were talking about their experiences of agency. So faculty were, and this was a total of 73 participants who completed the full survey. Over 82% referred to faculty. Over 38% referred to students, and over 45% referred to other librarians. So librarians definitely played an important role. And most participants focused on their individual agency in teaching when they were responding to the questions, but the majority, over 75%, also described it as having the potential to be shared. So individual agency was heavily influenced by relationships, social interactions, and environment. Participants also described their work relationships and environments as sometimes fostering and sometimes hindering agency. Over 19% said it supported agency. Now, this is people responding to the questions that I shared with you. So it's not that I asked them, please describe your work relationships and environments, right? These are just the things that are surfacing from those more open-ended questions. So these 19% did not mention their agency being hindered by work relationships and environments. About 11% described work relationships and environments hindering agency and did not mention agency being fostered. And then a little under 7% described their agency being both fostered and hindered by those work relationships and environments. And certain themes emerged, describing the conditions and experiences that people had that affected their sense of agency. So these are positive things that supported agency: mutual support, care, and open communication, informal interactions and conversations among colleagues, formalized collaboration. So these would be like, defined projects, working together towards a shared goal, and an experience of collective agency as having greater power to influence institutional culture and positive change. And I'll look a little bit more at that today. So there were a good number of people who expressed a sense of collectivism in their responses. And those people usually thought of collective agency in a positive light. So collectivism was often evident in the use of third-person plural pronouns like we and our. That was about 37% of participants who used those terms. And again, these terms, we are, were almost always used in a positive way. So if someone was experiencing frustration with colleagues, it was, usually not using these first-person plural pronouns. So a couple of comments that reflect this sense of teacher agency as collective. One person said, our sense of community is a big part of feeling agency, that I'm trusted to make decisions for my role and that I'll be supported in that. Another person said, we have procedural and systemic agency in our work, which obviates the need to try to manufacture a sense of agency where any is lacking. And some described a kind of solace in solidarity when they were experiencing frustrations in teaching. One person said, no matter what is in place and what culture we try to perpetuate in the library, sometimes things happen that make you feel devalued as a professional, or like a library instruction vending machine where faculty just insert a token and press in what they want and you deliver. When that happens, having like-minded colleagues to talk to is helpful. So again, this kind of informal conversations. Now, there is also a need to balance individual and collective agency. Collective agency among librarians was usually viewed positively, but sometimes required compromise that was frustrating and that limited individual agency. But many nonetheless saw those compromises as worthwhile when making decisions, when that decision-making process was truly collective. Many who described individual teaching as connected to collective goals noted the importance of balancing individual and shared approaches, and some stressed the need to allow flexibility in how individuals approached that work that was connected to a shared goal. Managers and supervisors could play an especially influential role. One person noted, for example, challenges with a manager and said, on a personal level, I had to fight very hard to gain personal agency and instruction in my department. My largest barrier was my immediate supervisor, who often refuses to delegate or monopolizes tasks that are considered important. Others fought a similar battle, right? So this person knew they weren't alone in this struggle. On the other hand, managers and leadership can be wonderful advocates. Two of the participants who had supervisory experience stressed the responsibility of library managers and leaders to advocate for librarians' teacher agency. And this included doing it through messaging to others in the library and the institution about librarians' roles, work, and value, fostering work environments of mutual trust, support, and valuing of colleagues' experience their expertise, and recognizing social and structural barriers to librarians' capacities to enact agency. These managers said the following two things. As the head of instruction for many years, I've worked to create an environment where librarians who teach know they are empowered to make decisions about their teaching in collaboration with faculty with whom they work. The library has their back if there are any complaints about this. And then another one said, our overall philosophy that we are partnering with faculty, is that we are partnering with faculty and have our own expertise, creates a sense of agency. So I'm going to do a little bit more analysis of this and discuss some of the implications that I see. A presence or absence of community, they both have an effect on people's experience of individual or collective agency. The sense of community and mutual support nurture positive experiences of that agency, not surprising, right? And the lack thereof can have the reverse effect. We need community within and beyond our workplaces. So there's, ideally, we find community within our own institutions, but sometimes that isn't possible for various reasons. And so community beyond individual institutions is also powerful. And it's especially important if the potential for community within a workplace is limited. Balancing shared and individual goals and approaches is something I mentioned a moment ago. So library instruction teams' shared projects ideally would be grounded in shared goals and values and designed with some flexibility that enables a balancing of those shared goals and unique teaching approaches. And library leadership can, again, be really powerful advocates. They are often highly influential in participants' experiences of being able to enact agency or not. And they can affirm librarians' positions as educators with unique expertise and skills, which can have effects for the individual immediately and how they feel, but then also can influence the entire system. So I'm going to pause and take another moment for people to reflect. In what ways do these findings connect with your own experiences? And do your experiences differ from certain findings? So I'm going to finish presenting, but you can continue to consider these questions, and then we will have some time at the end where we can share more about this and other thoughts that are coming up from based on the presentation. So I want to expand out and look to some related literature that this connects with. So one area that we've seen in instruction librarianship is a greater attention to the affective or emotional experience of instruction librarianship in particular. So people are looking more at what's sometimes called emotional labor in teaching, where we kind of regulate or modify our own emotions and our expressions of that emotions to others to match what we think is the appropriate way we're supposed to interact with others in that environment. So, there's a kind of emotional effort that requires. And often when we are in what are sometimes called caring professions, we're looking at, how can I help this other person feel good, feel comfortable, get what they need, which, can be a positive thing that we are attending to those things, but it also requires some emotional and cognitive work on our own parts to navigate that. There have also been increased challenges to vocational awe. That idea that librarianship is a calling, that it is a sacred kind of profession. Fawazia Attar has talked about this as often silencing problems within the profession and reinforcing unsupportive and inequitable workplace conditions. There have also been calls for challenging a neoliberal university of efficiency and return on investment. We see a lot of calls for us to prove our value as librarians. And many people have been calling question to this idea, is it really effective for us to always be trying to prove our value? Does this actually detract away from our sense of expertise, from our sense of agency, from our well-being when we are always kind of on the defensive and having to, crunch numbers and show that we're worth it because, there were this many outcomes related to the library. Now, I know there's a whole debate around that, and you could tell I have certain views about it, but so some alternatives that are sometimes presented are feminist librarianship, feminist pedagogy, and care. So really prioritizing care for ourselves and care for others, both our coworkers and others that we're interacting with, like students. Also calls for slow librarianship, for valuing taking time to not always have to rush and be efficient and get things done faster. Again, there's a balancing act there, right? But in libraries, we often see a push to innovate, to adopt these new things very quickly. And slow librarianship sometimes asks us to pause and think about, what would actually be the most helpful for people in this particular moment. There's also been increased research on workplace toxicity in libraries. So plenty of research to show that unfortunately there is widespread workplace dysfunction and toxic leadership in libraries, and that disproportionately impacts librarians from historically marginalized groups. And there has been a devaluing of library instruction work, as there has been of caring professions in general, of teaching, right? These are often feminized professions where the affective or emotional labor that we do is often considered to be something that people with a lower social status do, right? Though something that does not get paid as well, that is not as important or as rigorous. And this challenging of that view is, we're seeing articulations of that as well. There's also been an increase in communities of practice. And in fact, this conference, having grown itself out of a community of practice is an example of that. So looking to these communities of practice as one model for supportive culture. So communities of practice are places where professionals come together and they learn with and from one another, and they understand each other to be peers rather than a more hierarchical structure. And so they really stress the social dimensions of learning in a shared knowledge domain. And that sense of community and sense of belonging is a key aspect of communities of practice. And we've seen a growing interest in these in higher education as well as for librarians. So all of this work that I just described envisions the potential for healthier, more supportive, and more inclusive workplaces. Now, how we, make those really more supportive environments and more inclusive is, not a simple thing, but really bringing awareness to the different, factors that influence our workplace experiences and relationships, I think is an essential part of doing that. And so drawing attention to some of the issues that I just described can serve as a call for action. So I think there's a value in collectively exploring ways to foster individual and collective agency and to balance those two things, ways to foster desirable work and teaching environments, and investigating implicit assumptions that librarians may bring to our instructional work. And in that first article I wrote, I unpacked some of the assumptions that were reflected in people's associations with the concept of teacher agency. Now, assumptions can work for us and they can work against us, right? So I know often we talk about assumptions as being kind of like not good things. We inevitably have to work with assumptions just to live everyday life and get things done. But being able to take some time to look at some of those assumptions because sometimes they might not be working to our benefit. And they also value in exploring expanded possibilities for how librarians approach their instructional roles and work environments and relationships, and looking at ways to prevent burnout and cultivate communities and cultures of care. So as I mentioned, I have these 3 articles related to this study. So the first one is already available. You have the link there. And then the other 2 will be coming out. One fairly soon this year and another one next spring of next year. And they'll all be available through my ORCID profile. So I put the link to my ORCID profile there at the bottom. So I think now we can take time for further discussion, and you can also see the references here if any of those interest you. So I will stop sharing my screen. And I know I've said a lot, and I also presented you with some questions that we haven't discussed. So it looks like we have about 14 minutes left. And if people put things into the chat, I think that Laura was kindly going to be moderating that for me.
Absolutely. So we do want to open it up for questions. So please feel free to type in the chat your questions if you have them for Andrea. And Andrea, I actually have one for you too to kind of kick things off. We know that for teaching librarians, I think that this has slowly started to change, that we don't get a lot of official training to be educators in library school. Like I said, it's slowly changing. I think that we do actually have courses on instruction and teaching in, our programs. But do you think that there is a connection maybe between our lack of formal pedagogical training to be teachers and our maybe lack of teaching agency as librarians? Do you think that there's a connection there?
I think that's definitely one piece of it. At the same time, I've heard other people say this before. Most teachers in higher education didn't get that training either, right? Well, maybe more did through experience, because a higher percentage were probably in things like graduate assistantships, teaching assistantships, where they kind of learned by doing. And maybe or they took a course in pedagogy, but most of them did not. But we have teaching and learning centers on most campuses, partly because most people have not been given that training. And honestly, in my time as a librarian, I found that instruction librarians tend to be very passionate about what they do, and they tend to be very proactive in learning more through events like this are an example of that. And so a lot of times librarians actually have more teaching expertise than a lot of faculty. It varies a lot. So I'm kind of pausing as I don't want to make overgeneralizations, but, we often have more expertise than we really recognize. Now, when we're coming new into the profession and we might not have taught very long, that's, a greater challenge, I think, in, feeling like you have some agency, which I think is also true in almost any profession, right? You're newer to it, you're learning. And so it's inevitable that you need some time for gaining experience and practice. And so in the study it did show that, as people gained experience, they tended to also feel a sense of greater agency. But I think there's also a lot of other factors that go into play with, how the degree to which we feel we have choice individually and collectively. And I think a lot of it has to do with things like, the generally hierarchical nature of higher education, where librarians are often not perceived to have the expertise that we actually have, where there's, a kind of history of service librarianship. And not to say that service is bad, but sometimes if service gets understood as being subservient, right? That's a problem. When people aren't supported in acting on their own expertise, or feel that they're not able for whatever various reasons, they feel that they can't draw on their expertise, or they can't speak about, what they would believe would be an effective approach to, let's say, a workshop, right? Because we've got a lot of different messages that we've gotten in the profession. I think that's been shifting. And again, being a feminized profession, there are definitely gender dynamics that have played out in all of this. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer. I went a little bit beyond, but I think there's just so many factors, which is one reason that I think this ecological model can be really helpful, because it asks us to think about the many complex layers in any given situation and any given environment and any moment, right? That this is again dynamic, that it's not that the conditions are always the same from one moment to the next.
Absolutely. I think that's true. I think that point you make about other instructors and faculty members in higher education, it's true. A lot of them don't get that training either. And I even think of myself as I specialize more and more in instruction and my research agendas. I actually feel like I'm more of an expert in education and the scholarship of teaching and learning sometimes than I am in other areas of librarianship. Like you talk to me about cataloging and I'm like, I have no idea. Like I am so out of my element, right? But I feel much more adept to talk about, the scholarship of teaching and learning and some other things in librarianship. So I think that's a fair point. Thank you. So any other questions? I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, but also feel free to hop on the mic if you would like to. Oh, I do see one from Kate here. How can we overcome or work more positively with the rigidity of hierarchy within the library staffing model? Ooh, well, Andrea, if you can answer this question, I would love to hear it, but what would you like to say? It is a tough one, Kate, absolutely.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, like there's so much in that question. I'm trying to think about how to kind of go at it. Because we can think about hierarchy of higher education in general, right? And the position that librarians and library workers, right? Like we have people within our libraries. There's also a hierarchy within the libraries, which is what I was kind of hearing in Kate's question. So, I mean, I think, first of all, I don't think there's any like easy solutions. And I think that beginning by really recognizing that these environments and these structures really do influence us. They influence our individual experiences and our collective experiences. I think that part of the hierarchies that we can get within libraries are reinforced by, that system beyond it, where if you're in a profession where you feel undervalued, then it's easier to feel somewhat on the defensive. It's easier to feel competitive with others. So perhaps some of the hierarchy that we find within the libraries is also because there's a hierarchy outside of it, right? And also because we're not always feeling like we're in a position of power, where actually everyone can share power, right? So I think even the idea, like considering the idea that we can actually have shared power rather than that my having power has to kind of be in conflict, with someone else's, right? Like we have to fight for like how much power I have over here and you have over there. Like I think that is really embedded in our culture, and it's embedded in higher education, and so we see it in libraries as well. So some of these looks at, how can we have collective care? How can we really think about how the systems and structures and relationships are influencing our individual and our shared experiences and how we're acting and interacting? It's like a whole mental shift that is not easy to make, especially if people are feeling like their own ability to act depends on someone else not being able to act, or like someone else is keeping them from being able to act in a way that's aligned with what they care about, what their goals are, what their values are. So Kate, I'm sorry I don't give a better answer than that, but I think some of the references may also help to speak to some of this.
Andrea, I think that's a great reminder. I actually wrote down what you said, that when you feel undervalued, it's more likely that you will feel competitive, right, with someone else, whether it's in your own hierarchy within your own department or someone outside of your hierarchy. I think that's very important for us to remember. Thank you for that.
It makes me think of this concept of the sociological imagination that C.W. Wright Mills just talked about. That is the idea. So he talks about how personal troubles are public issues, but we often think my personal troubles are just like kind of contained to that. And there's, I think, a tendency in our culture to self-blame and to not always look at the structures and systems and how those may be influencing our individual experiences, and what choices we perceive as being available to us, or which choices are actually available to us. Like doing that by yourself is far less effective than if you're able to do it in community, right? And like being able to talk about these things in community is, I think, an important part of making that shift to having a culture where people are actually exercising mutual care and really, making an ongoing effort to do that, because it's not, we're all going to have our times where we're not able to do that, or, forget that can be a priority.
Just want to leave space just in case anyone else, we still have a couple minutes, but
and I'd welcome people to, just share comments too, or thoughts. I know I put in reflective questions before about how the findings connect with your experience, or maybe they are different from your own experience. And I see Emily put something in the chat here. Kate's question. Thank you. Glad to hear that that's helpful. As a newer librarian, I feel as though these dynamics exist between librarians, but not necessarily the same experience. I find it hard to build a community when it feels like an us, them, the library. Yeah, absolutely. And I've been at different institutions, and I just think we see a lot of this in librarianship and in higher education. And there's more naming of it that's been happening. And when it's named, then you can actually, start to do some things about it. When it's not named, when it's not recognized, then it's really hard to even, like, how do you even begin to address it if you haven't been able to name it?
Well, Andrea, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. We really appreciate you being here today.
You.
And so I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up your session. So the next session that's going to be in this room is Transformative Pedagogies, Rethinking Library Instruction Past One Shots. So if you're here for that session, or if you are going to stay for that session, you're in the right place. But we do have a few minutes if you need to go take a break, get some more caffeine or anything else like that. Please feel free to do so. So we have about 15 minutes or so. But again, thank you, Andrea. Thank you all for coming. And we will see you all in a few moments.
Thank you all. And I'm just going to put my email in the chat. So if anyone wants to discuss anything more, I like talking about these things and thinking about them. So thank you all again for being here today.
Thank you. Can't wait to read your article when it comes out as well.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Andrea, I also found your previous presentation. I've been linking it for you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was a while back. That was definitely a different stage because this project ended up being way larger than I expected.
It's all right. Credit where it's due, right?
Yeah. Thanks,
All
Aaron.
right.
That's great.
Yeah, no problem.